Thank you so much for being here. Good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody to this event on this exciting new book, When Jews Argue Between the Beit Midrash and the University. I'm Duncan MacRae. I'm an associate professor of ancient Greek and Roman studies here at Berkeley. I'm an affiliate of the Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm the co-director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. I'm going to be introducing these speakers and explaining the format. Each of the speakers deserves a much longer introduction than I can give, but our time is limited. We must move on. First, the three co-editors of the book. Our very own Professor Ethan Katz, Director of the Center for Jewish Studies and Associate Professor of History at UC Berkeley. As I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience, some of whom know Ethan very well indeed, he's a specialist in modern Jewish history, particularly in the Francophone world. He is the author of the groundbreaking, prize-winning monograph, The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France, and the editor of 4 volumes, most pertinently, the co-editor of When Jews Argue. Professor Sergey Dolgopolski, the Gordon and Gretchen Gross Professor of Jewish Studies at Gordon and Gretchen Gross Professor of Jewish Studies at SUNY Buffalo. He is also one of our own, a graduate of the Joint Program in Jewish Studies here at UC Berkeley and the Graduate Theological Union. In a remarkable and unmatched way, his work combines both Talmud and philosophy, academic philosophy. He is the author of 4 monographs, the most recent of which is Others, the Political After Talmud. If you look at the titles of Sergey's monographs, it starts with what is Talmud, and then it moves on until finally after Talmud. We can see the progress. Dr. Elisha Anscelovits teaches Jewish law, halakha, at the Pardes Institute for Jewish Studies, the Yeshivat Ma'ale Gilboa, and elsewhere. He is an affiliate of the Emory University Center for the Study of Law and Religion, which is one of the most lively, interesting such centers for law and religion. He holds a doctorate in religious studies, as well as rabbinic and judicial ordination. He has published widely on Jewish law in both public-facing and scholarly venues. After the editors of the book have each introduced the work a little, there will be 3 responses from colleagues here at Berkeley. I will give the first. Following me will be Dr. Deena Aranoff, Director of the Richard Dinner Center for Jewish Studies at GTU and Senior Lecturer for Medieval Jewish Studies. She also is currently teaching at Stanford. Deena took her PhD from Columbia and is a specialist in the religious history of medieval Jews. The third respondent is Professor Masua Sagiv, Koret, visiting assistant professor of Jewish and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley, and a scholar in residence of the Shalom Hartman Institute in the Bay Area. She has a doctorate in law from Tel Aviv University and is a leading scholar of law, religion, and politics in Israel. After that, well, the dialogue will open up. I'm tempted to say people will start to argue. So we will have some open discussion, hopefully with both the editors, the respondents, and the audience. This event is presented by the Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies and co-sponsored by the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. If you have the directors of the centers on the panel, you get sponsorship. We are very grateful especially to Etta Haber and Jennifer Lipscomb for their hard work, which has made absolutely everything here possible. Without further ado, the 3 editors of When Jews Argue.
Thank you, Duncan. That was, I'm glad that that was a brief introduction. I wouldn't want to see a thorough one for us. It's very kind. Thank you. And thank you to all of the respondents for agreeing. It's not a small thing to read a book. It's kind of a wacky book, as you're going to gather, and to try to think through what I'm sure are going to be really incisive responses. And I also want to thank my co-editors who traveled from far and farther Sergey from Buffalo, Elisha from Mala Gilboa in Israel to be here. So that means a lot to me, and I'm really excited for our conversation. I'm just going to say a little bit at the outset to give a sense of sort of how I came to this project. You're going to hear that the three of us have pretty different takes on the question of the relationship between knowledge that comes out of the academic Jewish studies world and knowledge from the world of the traditional study house, the Beit Midrash. So when I went to work at the University of Cincinnati, my first job, it's right across the street from the Hebrew Union College, which has in Cincinnati an extraordinary, the second or third largest Judaic library in the world, and the American Jewish Archives, and a lot of distinguished scholars over many years. And I thought, oh, this is so exciting. We should try to create a seminar for people who do things in Jewish studies. And there is also a significant Orthodox community in Cincinnati. And with incredible naivete, I was like, well, why don't we invite the people from the Kollel? And, it'll be so interesting. And it quickly became clear that the people from the Kollel were pretty skittish about the idea of talking about Jewish texts and Jewish questions in a room with a lot of Reform rabbis and a lot of people who were from academic Jewish studies. And as one of the people at HUC who I spoke to, who we anonymously quote in the introduction, said, once you start a conversation that has people whose basis is divine belief, you've moved out of the realm of academia, and you can't really have an intellectual conversation. And so I quickly realized that the idea of dialoguing across this divide was a lot more complex and challenging than I had thought. And I worked on a sort of seminar for a while there, and it was difficult to get traction. And I put the idea away for a while until I got connected to these two. What struck me over the years repeatedly is that as someone trained in my generation in modern Jewish history, many of my colleagues, many of my very smart, interesting colleagues, made a lot of assumptions about traditional Jewish texts and traditional Judaism without having felt the need, or their directors having felt the need, for them to be trained in those areas or to be competent with those texts. And I realized that you miss a lot of things. And I would encounter certain kinds of texts, particularly as I started to do more learning in traditional texts myself, and see that in modern settings that were ostensibly secular, there were really important things being said in a very religious vein. And you wouldn't find them at all if you didn't look for religious texts, and you wouldn't understand them very well if you weren't competent to read those texts. And so for me, a lot of this is about sort of, we call it expanding the canons in the introduction, my approach. And it's about, in a sense, expanding the bookshelf of the academy to include, important rabbinic writings as necessary for some level of familiarity for most people in Jewish studies, almost no matter your field, and expanding the bookshelf of the Beit Midrash to include important work from secular Jewish studies scholars in the academy whose work is often not taken seriously or not even known by people in that world. Another piece of what this is about for me is that part of the chasm there represents an inability for people to take each other's ideas seriously, to listen to ideas that they disagree with, and to figure out where the real tensions are. So, part of the hope, that we had. First, we had a big international workshop in New York City, which launched this. And it's a little embarrassing to say how long ago it was, but it was in October of 2018. So there, and in subsequent conversations, and in what comes out in the book, part of my hope is that we, sharpen our ability to argue with each other and really hear what the disagreements are about. Sergey's going to say a lot more about that, including quoting philosophers who I still don't understand after working with Sergey for 6 years. The last thing I want to say is that, to me, this book is potentially, hopefully, important methodologically. As some of my doctoral students will tell you with more than a hint of irritation, perhaps, I really believe in trying to practice this kind of education where they get breadth and depth in Jewish studies and breadth and depth in their area of history, including the region they're learning about from standpoints other than Jewish history. I was lucky to be trained that way, and to me, that's the sort of methodological implication in the academy of the kind of work here, is to push people to really take seriously in academic Jewish studies religious texts, Jewish law, Talmud. You don't have to be a Talmid Chacham to be a modern Jewish historian and do it very well. I'm not a Talmid Chacham. But I think that it really changes the quality of the work that you're doing. And a lot of the best scholarship that we've seen over a longer period of time comes from people who are able to immerse themselves in both of those worlds. And so I hope that the book will be something that colleagues in Jewish studies will use in methods classes and graduate seminars, and sort of use to think with about programmatic questions. So I'll stop there.
All right, so that's my turn, I think.
Yes. Your name is second on the front. So I think
So that takes care of that. Okay, thank you very much, Duncan, for the wonderful and intriguing introduction. Thank you, Ethan, for putting the panel together and in many ways for animating the three of us as one body, one tricorp instead of bicorp to really produce something which I definitely wouldn't have produced if it would be my only solo. So, and I want to thank Ethan and Elisha together for wonderful partnership that we developed over the, embarrassed to say, many years of working on that, and Zoom facilitated Hivrutas, which we're covering
week after week after week.
every Thursday for 2 hours. That was quite basically a little Beit Midrash, which we had. And Elisha once told me that whoever observed that on his end understood nothing about that except that it was very tensed. All right. So I would like, first of all, to second Ethan's institutional hope, at least I hope that was his hope, to produce a program in which, in Ethan's case, historians, in my case, philosophers, a PhD program in which philosophers would be exposed to rabbinic texts in their own modalities of reading and interpretation. I wouldn't mind the other way around as well, to take a yeshiva bochur and to expose him or her to philosophy. I think this is hard. Both of them are hard enterprises, but I'm more hopeful for somebody who is already doing a PhD in philosophy, also got serious training into rabbinic text and rabbinic thought, not by way of osmosis, which is normally done in a Beit Midrash setting, but by way of reflection and some kind of a theoretical description of what's going on. Of course, you can never learn swimming by reading the textbook about the theory of the swimming. So I'm hoping that this program would also include some practical hands-on, get your hands dirty experiences. So that's the institutional hope behind that. The remainder, the balance of this short introductory remarks should be basically a postscript for the book. Namely, I was asked to say what brought me to doing this. Well, after the book is over, is here on the table, I have a different idea. What was it? And I'm going to present this different idea. I am interested in what might be called an archaeology. Archaeology with the arche, the beginning, as the seriously taken word. Archaeology of two things: of modern university, as far as the Jewish studies, and in particular Jewish studies of rabbinic texts. Pay attention to the fold. Jewish studies of rabbinic texts, a monstrous thing, but it shows complexity. Jewish studies of rabbinic text and thought are concerned. And then another part of the same archaeological interest is the same project in the archaeology of the modern yeshiva or Beit Midrash. And in one particular aspect, as far as the engagement with tradition of text and thought is concerned. So how the university engages with rabbinical body of corpus of text and thought, and how does the yeshiva, Beit Midrash, do that? How tradition of rabbinic text and thought is construed, I will say corpus for brevity later on in continuation, is construed before it gets appropriated, negated, criticized, promulgated, etc., in these two institutions. Before relating to a tradition, one has to have an image of the tradition. And that image of the tradition is dubbed with Gérard Granel's very helpful term, tradition of tradition. So before you do something with a tradition, you have a tradition of that tradition. And that's where archaeology is coming in. How did this tradition of tradition took shape? And that's where it becomes important. That defines the second step in this expose. Despite interface level differences, and by interface I mean a standoff, which Elisha described between the yeshiva world and the academy world, despite the interface differences between the two modern phenomena, and they are modern phenomena, the Beit Midrash and the university, the Jewish studies of rabbinic tradition of text and thought and the yeshiva tradition of the same, the two are modern. And that means that there is the same set of archaeological transformations, meaning transformation medium from Middle Age to late antiquity to modernity, that inform the both, namely the advent of the self and the disappearance of the soul. I'm borrowing terms from Mark Textor's recent book about this transformation. That's only one element of that, the disappearance of the soul and the advent of the self. The other archaeological shift is the emergence of modern monster, and I will explain why I say monster, the modern monster of the subjectivity, and that conjoins different elements. The ancient, late ancient, and ancient idea of subjectum, that which is under, and hypokeimenon, to which such attributes as, for example, thinking as property is ascribed. That's one element, so the thinking is a property of something. The other element is the patristic tradition, coming back to Augustine and to Eastern Church Fathers, in which thinking is not a property of anything, not even of thinking itself. And therefore, there is no really substratum or subject for thinking. And then, all of a sudden, this comes together with the chasm of agency in the Eastern patristic, when they were talking about the will. So the willing and the user of the will, that who wills and that who appropriates the will as his or her own, are two different things. They did it because they wanted to figure out how Christ was able to have two wills, to go to cross and not to. And the combination of this, at least these three elements, the Augustinian idea of mind that is not property of anything, including not a property of itself, the Aristotelian idea that mind is a property of something, and the idea of the agency, which is different from the agent, it all smashes together in modern monster, which is most obvious for us, called subjectivity, self-conscious subjectivity. The short gloss for that would be subject agent conscious of the so-called her own actions. Subject agent conscious of so-called her own actions. So we normally, that's obvious for us. It's not hard to explain. Of course, I'm thinking, not a question. I'm the one who's doing the thinking. I'm willing, not a question. That's a monster, and the monstruosity of that becomes only understandable if we archaeologically look into the late ancient and medieval strata that I've mentioned only briefly here. By archaeology more broadly and at the same time more specifically, I mean what could be called a triangulation formed or informed by, first, Heidegger's three beginnings, the first beginning, the new beginning, which he condemns, which is Kant for him, and the other beginning, which is pre-Socratics, and then Michel Foucault's appropriation and reappropriation of this Heidegger's idea of three beginnings in his archaeology of self, sexuality, and knowledge, as well as the archaeology of the truth-telling. The next element is Reinhard Koselleck's idea of Vergangene Zukunft, which is translated as future is past, and means the futures which didn't come to be futures, but they still linger And we only can understand our past if we understand the futures that the past is still generating. So behind this monster of modern subjectivity, there still lurk these old, unrealized futures, which don't go away. They just do their work, suppressed. Collectively, and finally, Gérard Granel, Tradition of Tradition, which I've already mentioned. All of that I'm taken from the work of Alain de Libera and his project of archaeology of the modern subject, where, unfortunately but unsurprisingly, rabbinic texts are glaringly missing. Collectively, the archaeological optics, or rather haptics, makes visible, or rather palpable, the necessities by which the archaeology of the Jewish studies of rabbinic text and thought and the yeshiva study of that text and thought needs to be addressed not only in the level of interface between yeshiva and Beit Midrash and the university, but also on the level of their archaeological grounding in modernity, shared archaeological grounding in modernity, which also means in the late ancient and medieval tradition of thinking what thought is and tradition of what tradition is, and these archaeological movements, which I just hinted at, are heavily at work here and needs to be discerned on the university level of the tradition of tradition and at the yeshiva level. Coming back, and that's my last paragraph in this introductory part, coming back to the terms of the volume, the main move, therefore, for me was, and this was is now the was of today, not the was of the then, was to renegotiate the registers of the interface between the university and either Beit Midrash on the one hand between the university and Beit Midrash on the one hand, and the archaeological foundation of this relationship in the tradition of tradition, more specifically to the volume, from Itzhak Kanpanton via Wissenschaft des Judentums to Jakob Taubes and beyond, towards, and that's my last accord here, towards a disagreement as the transcendental foundation and transcendental goal, which however undermines the register of the transcendental, because Kantian subjectivity is predicated, the transcendental subjectivity is predicated on the possibility of agreement as the hope for the eternal peace. Here, the rabbinic tradition of tradition discovers both the possibility and suppression of disagreement as the ultimate goal, which therefore also undermines the possibility of the transcendental. And in the final of the final, I would like to say that I see Zahor's Yerushalmi's book on the table, not by chance. I want to put it as a proposition which is not developed in the book, but is a continuation of that disagreement, not in a modern sense that two people are trying to figure out what they disagree about, but in a sense of an effort to figure out what did we have forgotten about the tradition. When the Tanaim and, primarily Amoraim and the Stamaim and the Talmud argue and disagree, they don't disagree between themselves. They disagree about what do they remember, how well do they remember, what did the Mishnah say, what did the early strata of Amoraim said. So disagreement is actually an effort to remember, that is to say, an effort to tame the primordial elemental powers of forgetting. And this is the model which is radically different from our modern computerized world, in which forgetting is just the loss of memory. The other way around. Forgetting is primary. Disagreement is the way to fight it. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
So first of all, Duncan, thank you for the introduction.
Yeah, thank you.
Ethan, thank you for the invitation. It's my first time on campus. I would not have gotten here without your invitation.
First time in California.
That's true. I admit it, yes.
Really? Wow.
West of the
Sof Ma'arav.
Like Sof. Yes. And Sergey, thank you for those learning sessions. My wife said, I don't know what's going on, but you people are arguing a lot. Sorry. So I'm going to start with a story. I'm in 12th grade, and I'm debating which college to attend, depending on which gave enough scholarships, the whole thing. And one of them had a really good Jewish studies program. And I said, I want to attend that because yeshiva education is really, really black and white. It's not just like thinking in a very limited logical fashion, abstract logic, but also people tend to use that information to speak opinions, religious education. I said, that's what I should do. 12th grade, a little rebellious. Then I sat down and said, okay, let me, get more serious about academics. Let me really read seriously. I'm like, oh no, I'm seeing the same thing happen on the other side. So then I decided I'll just do pre-med. You see what that led to. Pre-med in the New York Public Library, which was an opportunity to actually not sit in the Judaic studies classroom, but actually just read philosophy. For all that, I pretend I don't understand philosophy, and the Jewish studies and so on and so forth, and primary sources. New York Public Library, it's a good resource. So that basically leads me into what I wrote in the book, and I guess how I would push beyond it today. So what I raised in the book is that basically I see a lot of misunderstandings in Jewish studies and the yeshiva, but I'm going to focus on Jewish studies in this setting for the moment. During questions, I'm happy to respond. A lot of misunderstanding because people aren't in warm conversation, as we discussed in the intro, which means they're hearing things from another culture and not translating it the way friends do. Friends hear something like, what? Oh, I get it. Right? So that's what I described in the book. And for years, I've been teaching, okay, how do you actually understand people across cultures? Okay, with all the postmodernist critique of texts. And basically, it comes down to you can understand people if they're discussing norms or they're acting, because the behavior allows for interpretation, and then the words can be interpreted subsequent to the behavior. Okay, so anybody that from Shlayim Quran, by text, words, no. Okay, rather it's first behaviors, and then from the behaviors I can get to the words. Okay, so I've done that, which is pragmatic analysis, if you will, depending on your discipline, semantic analysis also to a degree, and I've done that for years. And then I've been thinking since the book came out, like something else is going on. And I suspect what is going on is that we mix moralistic analysis with moralistic judgment with analysis. We want to say something about. And I'm like, for years, since I've been, since a teenager, I guess I've been a little rebellious. But at some point, for years, it's been my personality. I don't want to say something about somebody else. I want to understand them. Because if I don't understand them, how will I learn anything about life other than what I know? And that's just an echo chamber. And I think that's the biggest gap that's missing in academia and the yeshiva. And basically, I'm not about great large theories. I'm about it's possible to understand people. I'm a pragmatist, but not a neo-pragmatist. And even William James and Pierce are a little bit too sophisticated for me. I'm just a simple person interpreting people in conversation because I'm not judging them. Wait, let's be clear. I do judge. We get to arguments. But when I'm trying to understand them, for that moment, right? Yes, so I think what this book can do, and I know, Sergey, we're in an argument, and Ethan, we're not in an argument, we're in a disagreement or something. Sergey will tell us what we're in, but if we are, okay. But the vision I have is just whatever institutions exist, they should be places to learn how to be human. That's it. Not sophisticated, just simple. And that's hard enough. It's not complex, it's complicated. Meaning many simple steps, it's complicated, but not complex. So that's what I hope this book somehow eventually leads to.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for these introductions, which, for someone who's read the whole book, is like a little bonus chapter. It expands, and I appreciate what all three of you have just said. I'd like to thank you all for the chance to speak here, but also for, this is a profoundly interesting book, which Ethan just called wacky, but actually it's a sort of book that should exist much more often, which is a book that strains against the boundaries of academic or religious discourse, which tries to genuinely push at the edge on each of them. It's a trope for responses like this to say how much the author learned, how little, how less competent the author, the respondent is than the authors, and in this case, this is like transcendently true, but not transcendent in Sergey's sense, just absolutely true. I'm very incompetent, and I learned a great many things.
That's the main word that I use to describe you, Duncan.
It seems obvious to me, and we've just heard, that this is a book born in dialogue between the three editors, and now that it is tangible between two covers, it's a book that I hope invites continuing dialogue, not just between the Beit Midrash and the university, between devotion and relativism, which is the main pair that the editors talk about in their introduction, but with anyone who is concerned with religious and intellectual life in our increasingly post-secular society. Such dialogue, or dialogues, I hope, require that we face up to our own situatedness, to have clarity about where we speak from, and we just heard three models of that. The authors in the book, beyond the three editors, also model this ethic, I think, in quite excellent ways. In particular, I will point neighboring essays on consent and on feminism by Aviva Richman and Naomi Seidman give profound and engaging accounts of how their gender and religious positionality has shaped their views towards rabbinic law. So with that in mind, I must confess my own. I'm a London Irish Catholic. I attend Mass, at least sometimes. And I haven't eaten a sweet thing for the last 5 weeks because it's Lent. But I think it's also fair to say I'm very theologically liberal in the spectrum of contemporary Catholicism. Commonweal, not first things. You know. I'm also a classicist. Thanks to the shape of the British and Irish education systems, I've spent the last 29 years, since I was 11, studying and teaching Latin and Greek, obsessed with Greek and Roman history and culture. I encountered academic Jewish studies only at graduate school, where I was fortunate to find myself a teacher, Shia Cohen at Harvard, who was welcoming to a classicist who wanted to engage with Jewish traditions as part of my studies of antiquity. It's thanks to him and to several other teachers and colleagues that I'm not just a classicist. One of those identities I don't speak about very much in public, and the other I'm a bit ashamed of. So, a story like this one will be familiar, I think, to many here who are involved with university Jewish studies, whether you've invited non-Jewish students in to learn more about Jewish traditions and cultures, or you've been maybe a recipient of such invitations. And here, of course, is a distinguishing trait from the Beit Midrash, where non-Jews are considerably less likely to be present. It's possible, of course, but sometimes not really that welcome. And for dialogue on that topic, and the Babylonian Talmud tractate Sanhedrin 59a has you can find some fascinating views about Gentiles and Torah study. But how then may we trouble the devotionist relativist divide, especially as people, or with people maybe, who do not share the same devotion? To have a go at this question and to think with the editors, I hope, I'd like to offer a jeu d'esprit, an imagined 12th chapter for the book that engages each of their three modes, expanding the canon, defining disagreements, and warm conversations. And as title for my proposed chapter, I'd like to pick classics. Classics, I contend, can make a useful rubric for thinking about what can be done on the university side of the subtitle. For the modern university, classics has meant something particular, a discipline encompassing Greek and Latin literature and Greek and Roman history. I'm also really conscious that Eric Gruen is in the audience, so there's a... okay. This meaning is what my department's new name of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies aims to make more visible. But I think I'm going to offer genealogy rather than archaeology, Sergey, but I would like to give a little genealogy about classics and the modern university because I think it really bears on this topic. Fundamentally, classics is a product of Protestant German aesthetics at the end of the 18th century. Under the influence of the art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann, German writers and thinkers became convinced that the study of Greek literature and art, as well as an appreciation for Roman historical achievement and grand tours to Italy, frankly, would allow them to develop a superior aesthetic culture. Mostly superior to French, but just generally. In Winckelmann's much-repeated dictum, quote, "The one way for us to become great, perhaps inimitable, is to imitate the ancients." In the next generation, two friends, Friedrich August Wolff and Wilhelm von Humboldt, can stand in for the two impulses that then emerged. Wolff was the scholar, very famous Homerist, but he also wrote a key early manifesto for classics as a discipline, his Darstellung der Altertumswissenschaft, his description of ancient studies, which laid out a program for what we might call multidisciplinary research on the totality of Greek and Roman culture. But he took particular concern to exclude Hebrew literature, which he said was on aesthetic grounds. The prose was not artful, and therefore had to be outside. I mean, we can be skeptical about what the real grounds were. That's obviously, yeah. His friend von Humboldt was the mover and the shaker. As a young man, Greek and Roman literature was central to his theory of Bildung, which really, and here I intersect with Sergey very intensely, which he saw as the realization of the capital I individual through devoted attention with classical texts. And in 1809, he had the chance to put the theory into action. As the head of the education department for the Interior Ministry of Prussia, the Kingdom of Prussia, he founded the university in Berlin, a new kind of university that would combine teaching and research. And of course, he intended every student in every field of study to read the Greeks. In other words, for von Humboldt, and the university that currently bears his name, the university was born as a site of devotion, right? But not as we might think. Altertun's Wissenschaft served as a key model for Wissenschaft des Judentums, of course, the 19th century forerunner of Jewish studies. The university at Berlin is the progenitor of the idea of the contemporary American research university, and global now. And until the 20th century, most American universities required Greek and Latin simply for entrance, which of course was the von Humboldtian ideal. After more than 2 centuries, this vision of classics is on the rocks. In the pages of the New York Times, a colleague and friend, Danelle Padilla-Peralta, a classics professor at Princeton, has called it equal parts vampire and cannibal. I will spare you the gory details, but the critique, well-earned critique in my view, is that university discipline forged by white Protestant men for the discovery of their own individuality is not fit for purpose in a modern multicultural societies. Certainly, and I want to be really clear about this, women, Jews, Catholics, for that matter, many other people from all kinds of racial and religious backgrounds have thrived in the field of classics. And in the university, indeed, over its whole history. But it is undeniable, I think, that the regime of value that determines the referent of the classical and classics is inarguably provincial. For Altertun's Wissenschaft, and I'm so glad I put this paragraph in now, as you'll see, ancient studies, the fix seems to me to be easy, and in fact has been underway for more than 50 years. A broadening of the program of multidisciplinary research to all ancient peoples, including, of course, ancient Jews. Eric Gruen, and our emeritus colleague here at Berkeley, proposed exactly this in 1992, right, so that's 32 years ago, in a presidential address to the Maine National Association of Classicists. And I believe in Eric's the vision that Eric laid out there, and I think it still has power. But might we also consider a new discipline of classics? One fit for the post-secular. Why should classics in the university not mean the study of textual traditions, oral and written textual traditions, religious, philosophical, legal, cultural traditions in general. One could imagine, I think, a program of study and research that set rabbinic literature alongside Sanskrit epic, the Chinese classics, and even, some Greek and Latin poetry and philosophy. These could be Elisha's warm conversations, consideration of how, and I much appreciate your vision of humanism, Elisha, consideration of how different traditions narrate stories or conceptualize fundamental human dilemmas. Not just a bland cataloging of who thought that, who thought this, but a real attempt to see what each tradition could does for its communities. I imagine that some of you are thinking that sounds rather familiar. It's great books, you say. Not at all. Would not sign up for that. That is a return to the shoals of axiology, in my view. Instead, the expansive view advanced by When Jews Argue points the way. With Ethan, we can expand the canon in all of these traditions. In an essay entitled What is Classical About Classical Antiquity, James Porter, our colleague in Jewish Studies and Rhetoric, has offered a reflection on how the Greek and Roman classical is itself a product of mediated judgment. A text or artwork becomes classical because others have valued it. We might note that this process is ongoing even now in the increasingly common scholarly term classical rabbinic literature to refer to the texts of Chazal, the Talmudic sages. Following Porter, my imaginary new classics would encompass not just Tanakh and Talmud, but medieval grammarians and early modern responsa. Not just the Sanskrit Ramayana, but all the reworkings of that story in other South Asian idioms. Not just Sappho, but HD's queer modernist rewritings. Classics in this sense could never be complete. I think, in fact, it might provide a ground for Sergey's defining disagreements. Might we posit classics not as the study of closed canons, but as a Kantian regulative ideal that is an unattainable, a priori unattainable goal that we can use pragmatically to unify different traditions while avoiding questionable assertions of fundamental similarities. Classics, then, may enable contestation, may enable devotionists and relativists from all global perspectives to make claims of incommensurability, even as it provides the site for these disagreements. Our tradition is not classical. That tradition is not classical. Can be the way to disagree. I entertain no real hope that such a thought experiment would have made the grade for a chapter in their book. Nor do I think the current conditions in the university would be hospitable at all for such a disciplinary project. I must insist, however, on the value of utopian thinking about the university. Humboldt's dream of Bildung has passed away. I think that's quite clear. But we must be willing to have new ones. So thank you again to the editors and the authors for their essays and for giving me a moment to dream. Deena.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here and to see the circle of community and university members here this morning and to be invited to join on this panel. Thank you. The editors of this volume placed a group of scholars in the enviable position of considering the divide between devotional and critical engagement with religion. So I'm one of the lucky people who was asked to read the volume. I'm assuming that many of you have not yet read it, but it just seemed as if you threw to the participants this wonderful, almost game, like, here you go. Here's this divide. What do you have to say about it? How can we work with it today? And it got me thinking, because I've often thought of myself as having entered the world of Jewish studies long after this divide had already been undone. I remember reading James Kugel in one of his early books on Hebrew Bible scholarship, and I think it's in the concluding essay, although that would be silly. It should be in the beginning, because there's a section that says, warning, if you have traditional commitments that flow from the precepts and narratives of the holy Hebrew scripture, stop reading now. And I remember thinking that was a different, it was unfamiliar to me, and perhaps because Yosef Yerushalmi was my teacher at Columbia, and I had had this firsthand experience of the memorable, pathos-filled attachment in the instruction of Jewish history, that it was kind of seemed like, oh, that's what used to happen. You'd go into an undergraduate classroom, the lecturer would tell you about the various documents that together yielded the Hebrew Bible, and then you would have a crisis of faith, or the early Maskilim with their narratives of everything was hunky-dory, and then someone showed them a little sheet of the writings of the Rambam, of Maimonides, and another crisis of faith. Those almost seemed like literary tropes to me, which probably says something about my own biography, which maybe I didn't include in my short remarks here. But nevertheless, as I settled into reading this book, I thought, it's kind of interesting to reconsider that divide. Does it still organize enough people's way of thinking that it needs some intellectual handling? And actually, even just hearing, Ethan, your reflections on the genealogy of the project, coming very much from your firsthand experience in Cincinnati, I can see that it does still need handling. But for example, when I read Zachor, I hear in Zachor intimations, or even more than intimations, of somebody who's already repairing this supposed breach, despite the melancholy tones, and that was just his way. May his memory be a blessing, really, but he was melancholy. And despite the fact that he is often named as the principal architect of the divide, he authored the eulogy for the enchanted, approach to the classical materials. But when you go back to the book itself, and if you were lucky enough to sit in on his lectures, you would see that he, in a way, was inviting historians into a way of writing history. At the end of the book, he says, if it isn't memorable, please don't write it. So he was trying to forge some kind of meaningful way of critical engagement with the Jewish past. In fact, he proposes, and just to mention, I think in particular, he, as you know, he also wrote about Freud. I think one of the paths he hoped to pursue was the possibility that a psychoanalytic framework for approaching the past and narrating the past might be very productive. He talks about, I'll just read this from Zachor. Perhaps the time has come to look more closely at ruptures, breaches, breaks, to identify them more precisely, to see how Jews endured them, to understand that not everything of value that existed before a break was either salvaged or metamorphosed, but was lost. That's the forgetting. And that often some of what fell by the wayside can become, through our retrieval, meaningful to us, which I kind of see happening in Aviva Richmond's essay. She finds the fractures in the Talmudic text. One of the essays in here is a close study of a Talmudic sugya in which, using critical analysis, one can see that it has a history and that there were various hands that played a role in the development of the sugya, and that seeing those fractures, or what Charlotte von Robert calls disturbances in the text, often provides an entry point to appreciate the history of the text, which actually allowed her to retain a kind of sympathy with a text that would otherwise have been so alienating because of the directions it went into. It was like it humanized it. It warmed the conversation, having recognized the human hands in its making. So far from creating a crisis or a distancing from these materials, the critical apparatus that she applies creates a closeness, and it's an intimacy. It doesn't mean it, therefore, it doesn't result always in a positive valuation of it, but it is a closeness. that she's able to retain through the use of critical scholarship. So Yerushalmi, this is at the end of Zachor, alludes to modes of relating to the Jewish past in which you acknowledge ruptures, but that's not in order to properly archive it in the dustbins of history, but as a way maybe of recovering an attachment to it, which has been, my own experience. And I think that broadly speaking, it's arguable that the long-held dichotomy between critical history and devotional engagement with Judaism has lost its grip on the contemporary Jewish imagination. Recent decades have witnessed a growing capacity to appreciate Judaism not as a stable or fixed essence, or even as a dialectical unfolding of a timeless spirit. I'm channeling Yerushalmi, apparently. But instead, as the fluctuating and fragmented movement of a civilization over time. And the potency and even sanctity of this civilization does not rest on a fixed metaphysical claim. Its wisdom derives from 3,000 years of human experience folded into its teachings and practices. Rather than undermining the tradition, its instability is suggestive of its vitality and its generative capacity. A few of your comments had me thinking also about the ethics of engagement, that approaching Jewish texts and practices, even classical ones, now I can't use the word classical without wanting to add a footnote, but approaching them with awareness of its historicity, it's arguable, is also a way of engaging ethically with it, because it's not, you don't just kind of project a metaphysical meaning, timelessness, but you're just exploring it over time, coming to get to know it. And Naomi Seidman was very kind to put a little footnote to basically conversations she and I have been having over the years about it's almost like getting to know a person, and rather than imposing some essential character upon them, but to allow them to present themselves in all of their detail to you, not as a way, the opposite of reducing them. It's kind of expanding them to the fullest capacities that description will allow, just total seeing. So, and I'll just kind of try to wrap up so there's time for conversation. The question I had is, so then why is it still interesting to consider the divide? Because it is still interesting. That's why this book is so good. It's like, it's still interesting to consider it. Why? And then I thought, I think it's because we enjoy the many ways that the scholars go about thinking about it. It's the pleasures of that style. And that's the kind of panoply of these essays. I was just have a few, just select references here, like Sergey's identification of the Talmud as a discipline of thought. Just inviting one to consider the Talmud in philosophical terms. Naomi Seidman questions whether the transfer of male Talmudic modalities to the academy, whether it is really as radical as one might think. And she then explores other modes of Jewish expression in which devotion to Torah can operate in new and radical ways. She calls it Torah without Talmud. Daniel Isaac considers the ways that the medieval grammarians, famous for, in a way, being among the first to apply harsh critical analysis to scripture especially, but the ways that those grammarians applied their art in a way that actually drew from traditional approaches, so that their grammar was not necessarily a departure from tradition. Tamara Morsel-Eisenberg considers early modern rabbinic responsa that include some consideration of the dating of the Zohar in figuring out whether it's relevant in a halachic determination. Jacqueline Rubin Layer explores the ways in which the landscape of early childhood does not know from this divide, and the ways in which storytelling and ritual performance allow for the inscription of tradition upon the child without relying upon that differentiation between critical engagement and devotional engagement. And as I mentioned, Aviva Richman finds the fracture points in the Talmudic text in ways that reveal the layers of history and human voices as they shaped them, which then engenders a sympathetic reading of the text. I guess, and as I am concluding by saying, why are we still asking the question? And the first thought is maybe we're asking because of the delight in how we might think about it. And then I also just thought, are we still asking the question because it's possible that the worry about it, the urge to reconcile, is not so much coming from there not having been well done intellectual reconciliation. Like maybe that's in a way already been done. The issue is that the urge for reconciliation is not coming from the intellectual problem, but a kind of deeper worry about the broader conditions of modernity and the attenuated attachments to tradition, not necessarily because of the academic challenge, but I mean for kind of any number of challenges. And I again just go to Yerushalmi because it's kind of interesting. His chapter, Modern Dilemmas, starts out with this quote from Kafka, that as the kind of superscript, and the quote is as follows: "You really had brought some traces of Judaism with you from the ghetto-like village community. It was not much, and it dwindled a little more in the city and during your military service. But still, the impressions and memories of your youth did just about suffice for some sort of Jewish life. Even in this, there was still Judaism enough. But it was too little to be handed on to the child. It all dribbled away while you were passing it on." Is this a passage about the crisis of critical inquiry? I don't think so. Does it perhaps reveal the true source of melancholy? That is, the mechanisms of social and cultural production in modernity. In which case, how do our academic endeavors address what is in fact at the heart of this great concern? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm sure you're very tired by now, but allow me one more comment, and thank you so much for inviting me here. And congratulations on this project, which is, I find, not only important, but deeply resonates with me personally as someone who's both devoted and it's a hard time to say relativist, and I'll explain why in a minute. You've heard the terms devotionist and relativist a few times. Let me give you one paragraph about what they actually mean in this book, which I think is not necessarily the everyday meaning of these two terms. So the book describes the goal of its project as having the academic world and the Jewish world to engage with each other, breaking the division between what the editors define as religious devotion and academic relativism. While both deeply dealing with Torah in its most general sense, the methodology and ideology of the Beit Midrash is defined by devotion to the religious dogma and attachment to traditional beliefs and practices. It is textualized. It's focused on Jewish texts and tradition in a way that allows depth and access. As opposed to the Beit Midrash, those academics who pursue Jewish studies are defined by relativism, which connotes a secular removal from religious dogmatism. It is contextual. It emphasizes the wider culture, the social context in which the Jewish experience has unfolded. In fact, the editors tell us that the relativists are devoted to their own view of what research is, whereas the devotonists question other beliefs that are not theirs. For those two contrary fields to engage with each other, the editors suggest three strategies that encompass both substance and structure. expanding the canon, that's Ethan, adopting a positive method of discourse, which is Elisha, and openly defining, I don't know if you'll agree of how I redefined you, openly defining what the disagreements are. And the different chapters of the book, I think it's very, very interesting because they engage with the engagement, and sometimes they demonstrate what you want to do, and sometimes they really, really challenge what you want to do. The actual basic framing and not just the dialogue that you're promoting. So the book is incredibly rich, and I only have 10 minutes. So I want to offer 4 short notes or observations. The first I really found interesting, choosing relativism to describe academic Jewish studies. At first glance, it seems that the 2 terms that were chosen, devotion and relativism, are read positively and negatively based on the position that you are at, based on the location of the reader or the learner. Devotion is positive for the observant Jew, whereas for the secular Jew, it is negative as it translates to lack of criticism or lack of context. And relativism, which is valuable to the curious researcher that has no earlier and binding commitments, is almost derogatory for the observant Jew. I am very intrigued by the choice of relativism that means that there is no one truth, as opposed to pluralism, for example. That means there is a truth, but I'm not sure. I'm doubtful that the truth, that I'm the one who's holding it. By the way, Elisha, you said before, I want to understand people, and I was wondering, do you want to understand people or the approaches or values or all of them, which is slightly different, I think. It feels to me that relativism deconstructs, whereas pluralism enriches, which led me to think that, in fact, maybe devotion and relativism are not equal opponents in your eyes, but that the devotion is actually the baseline for you, and then only on top of it, or as complementing it, you lobby for criticism and context, and not really perhaps for relativism. I don't know. Which leads me to my second note. For many of the scholars given as examples in the book as combining both devotion and relativism, I think it's interesting to think about the relationship for them between devotion and relativism. I know that for me, my relativism, I'm calling it relativism, but I just want to note here that I really oppose the calling it relativism. But my contextualizing, I'll do contextualizing. My contextualizing or criticism. What?
It is a word we consider.
Yes, sorry for all the chuckling that we're doing. You have no idea how much time we spent on these terms. We can talk about that.
I'm sure you did. But I have the advantage of criticizing your product right now as it lies here. I apologize. I think
no
it's
need to apologize.
brilliant.
Some of us are in agreement with you when we lost arguments.
So anyway, my contextualism is based on my devotion, in personally, even serving my devotion. And Michael Walzer, the political philosopher, speaks of social criticism and highlights the connected social critics, whose criticism on society stems from their deep connection and loyalty to the society that they criticize. Religious feminists are connected critics. Tanya Waldox define religious feminism's political agency as devoted resistance. Their loyalty to the religious society and culture is the starting point and the basis of their identity. Their affinity both to the criticism, here the relativism, and to the culture that they criticize, here the devotion, is both what drives their criticism and what enables it. The criticism for these women has a clear goal: driving change in contemporary Judaism because they are devoted to it, which leads me to my third point. Though present in some of the chapters as examples or discussions, I was missing a third field or actor from the structure of academia relativism and the Beit Midrash textualism or devotion. Devotion and relativism are presented as almost static. And what I was missing was actually activism or change. There's an additional struggle or tension in our world, in the Jewish world right now. And that's the distinction between limud lema'aseh, study and practice, Torah ve'avodah. What's interesting for me is that both the Beit Midrash and academia are susceptible to that critique of living in an ivory tower or between the walls of the Beit Midrash. I'd like to suggest that just as academia and the Beit Midrash are losing from not engaging with each other, as you claim, both academia and the Beit Midrash are losing from not engaging with the reality on the ground. In the last chapter of the book, Lieberman refers to this as the real-life consequences for women and the organization of the Jewish family. But rather than placing reality or social trends as the result of the tension between devotion and contextualism, I would actually position the dynamism of reality as a third point of a triangle. The drive to change, the activism, a third foundation to the structure of contemporary Judaism, which I feel like you present a structure of contemporary Judaism. And I would encourage engagement of both devotion and relativism with it, since the change agent, in my example, the religious feminists, but we can think of other examples as well, engage both with the tradition and with the criticism that stems from relativism, but are many times ignored by both the ones who are sitting in the Beit Midrash, but also by those people who sit in the faculties until reality forces them to notice the change. Such engagement, I would argue, will help the Torah of the Beit Midrash to be a living Torah, and the work of the relativists to actually be validated from a devotionalist perspective. And my fourth and last point is closely connected and is a result of a feminist lens to this project, although I have to say, despite my current resentment as an Israeli woman towards feminism these days. The goal of the project is, as we said before, is the engagement. Because without it, both sides lose the possibility to learn from each other. I think it is important to note, as Naomi Zeidman also notes in the book, what or who is missing from this framework. So Zeidman defines the goal of the engagement as a third space between academic and devotional social spaces and intellectual spaces. So she says that this book really intends to create the third space, which is where we can combine both of them together. And she argues that there is a distinctly gendered dimension to who is most able to occupy this third space, or who is almost unable to occupy it. The possibilities, overlaps, and tensions between relativism and devotion are not the same for women as they are for men. The key elements of this for Zeidman is the study of Talmud, as Deena said before. Zeidman identifies successful relativists as having yeshiva background. And we indeed see that this is many, if not most of the examples that are given by the editors, and I think that also with the editors themselves. The continuity between devotion and relativism, yeshiva and university, are unavailable for women, Zeidman claims, where the first system, the yeshiva, excludes them, even when the second system ostensibly welcomes them. As a result, Zeidman advocates for a different focus to contemporary Judaism than the Talmud, when the early Beit Yaakov serves as her model. Though I agree with Zeidman's analysis of the problem, it almost felt to me like she's fighting a straw man, and I would like to take a slightly different angle. In the last 4 decades, women who had no place in the Beit Midrash just went to academia. And it is almost a metaphor of the division of roles, but in a feminist age, right? So the men go to the yeshiva and the women just go to academia, go to the university. And I think that we cannot ignore the fact that what allowed women to thrive in Jewish studies in academia is the source of the disrespect the Beit Midrash has towards academia. So academia is theoretically open to all, right? According to merits. It's not essentialist. And the relativist approach is a way to expose the power relations under the surface of the Beit Midrash method of learning, the voices that are silenced or unaccepted or undervalued. All these are clear threats to the survival of the Beit Midrash in its original structure. I find very interesting, and also I'd like to thank you all, that if you'll notice, all three of respondents are others to this inner discourse, which I think is important. Ethan, you said before that people aren't trained in these texts as historical, right? When I was drawn to write about halachic feminism in Israel, I wasn't trained also, because I was excluded from entering this space. And I don't know if it's not ironic, but it's interesting that the place where I found myself opening these places, these texts, it wasn't the university, because the university didn't really allow a serious engagement, and it wasn't definitely not the yeshiva world, the Beit Midrash world, but what it was the Hartman Institute that tries to live in the same places, where it's the first time, I won't forget, the first time that someone put a Talmud in front of me and said, "What do you think?" Which was a completely new experience for me. In fact, when, as part of the religious feminist movement, women have started entering the Beit Midrash, there was a real question on whether or not it will change the way that the Beit Midrash itself works. The answer to this question is complex. The expectation of women who entered the Beit Midrash to balance or amend the patriarchal voice of halakha faces two challenges. First, if women want their voice to be heard in a male space, they might have to adopt a male voice. And the second, more importantly, women, at least in the Orthodox society, goes through the same process of halachic socialization as men. And the way they are educated to think is a devotionist way that reflects the male inner grammar of the halachic system. So according to this approach, women's Beit Midrash study and halachic ruling will necessarily be the same as men's, influenced by gender biases. Indeed, Rav Shagar claimed about 15 years ago that Torah study for women is, but that's not my words, but is nothing more than an imitation of the male voice who is fixed and unimaginative. If I'm trying to implement the book's framework on the religious feminist world, we have on the one hand devotionists who are motivated by their criticism, but are struggling with inserting this relativism inside the walls of the Beit Midrash. And on the other hand, we have relativists who would not get access to the Beit Midrash, so they went to academia, and their devotion leads their criticism. I think we see more and more examples that inhabit the third space, like, for example, Rabbanit Malka Piotrkovsky in Israel in her halachic book. And like the editors, I would love to see the result of more discourse between these two worlds, and I think that the scholarly, both religious and academic, of religious feminists provide a compelling model of inhabiting the third space. I want to thank you again for this book that is thought-provoking for many ways. And I think that it is in and of itself a call for change in the way that contemporary Judaism is organized. Thank
you. The editors must have the chance to respond, but I think everybody went just a little bit long. So I think in order to have a wider discussion, hopefully we can be relatively brief and then open it up.
We could easily talk for an hour, and I'll avoid that. Thank you all so much. These are really deep and really thoughtful comments and really thought-provoking. And of course, there's part of you that wants to say, "Oh well, yeah, you're right. We should have done that differently in the book." But hopefully, to Duncan's notion of the classics as never finished, this was never meant to be the last word. It's meant to provoke these kinds of conversations. So I do want to respond quickly to what Deena said about her revered teacher, the extraordinary scholar, Zichrono Livracha, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, because Yerushalmi was deeply yeshiva educated. He actually had ordination from JTS, as you know, Deena, and then was, the greatest Jewish historian of his generation by many measurements. And so when I went back to read Zachor while we were in the middle of this project, I actually had the thought more that Yerushalmi is kind of a model for the kind of discussions that we're pushing for across this divide. What struck me in the book, which we quote in the introduction, which I'll just read here for a minute from the introduction, in a way I feel like he ends up really, in some way, inscribing that divide pretty deeply in that last chapter of Zachor. Zachor reflects the author's extraordinary reach as a scholar familiar with not only the extant scholarship on Jewish and wider European history, but also the corpus of classical and rabbinic Judaism. The book brought together in a novel way the long-standing traditional rituals of Jewish collective memory and the much more recent practice of academic Jewish history. Yet it combined them only to sever them more firmly apart, as Yerushalmi made a sharp distinction between the former, traditional rituals of Jewish collective memory, and the latter, Jewish history, one of the book's central points. In the work's final section, he described the latter as in modern times, that is, academic Jewish history, the faith of fallen Jews. This is a phrase that's had a lot of purchase since that time. This expression seemed to imply the incapacity of the Jewish historian to speak to traditional Jews, to replace the eroded collective Jewish memory with the findings of their research. Those Jews, Yerushalmi insisted, quote, who are still within the enchanted circle of tradition, or those who have returned to it, find the work of the historian irrelevant. They seek not the historicity of the past, but its internal contemporaneity. Addressed directly by the text, the question of how it evolved must seem to them subsidiary, if not meaningless. And so we go on to say for Yerushalmi, it was all too obvious that, quote, modern Jewish historiography cannot address itself to those Jews who have never fallen. Now, I think part of your point, Deena, to be fair, was that Yerushalmi seems to want to urge us to, in a sense, tell better stories as a way to address that religious public. So he doesn't necessarily entirely give up on the possibility of dialogue. But I do find that he ends up sounding not just melancholy, but pretty absolutist in a sense about that divide. Should have prefaced, I will say, as an important postscript, he wasn't my teacher. I never had the opportunity to even meet him or hear him, and I also believe that you probably have, fundamental insights of that experience that I don't have in terms of understanding him. I respond partly because I think there's been a number of people have sort of questioned our reading of Yerushalmi, so I wanted to partly just sort of explain it, and I'm also, willing to recognize that maybe we didn't get it exactly right, or there's room for multiple readings. I think that the point that you directed us to from Jackie Rubin's essay, that early childhood does not know from this divide, I think is a very interesting point for us to think with more. I mean, particularly if one wants to think about sort of redefining our disagreements, redefining what the Beit Midrash or the Academy could look like to keep utopian notions alive, to point to Duncan, sort of, what does the world look like when you don't know from this divide, and what possibilities could that open up? Masua, you had a lot of really good questions and I think important critiques. There was something I wanted to respond to in particular. I did want to just say that we had a lot of discussion about the terminology of devotion and relativism, and we considered many other alternatives, particularly to relativism. I made a little list here of some of them. You mentioned pluralism. I don't think we actually talked about that one. Historicism, reason, critique, skepticism, and context. And I think that's just a handful off the top of my head. Sergey was the important advocate for relativism, and he may have a lot to say about why it was the right choice. But I think that I'm glad that you brought up the question about religious feminism, and I don't know if you or any of the commentators have more to say about what the book. I sort of had a hope that because the book has several chapters that deal with gender in different ways, that it has the potential to do more with gender than it does in a front-loaded way. I don't know if that's actually true or not, and I would love to hear if you have any thoughts about that. But I think your point is very important, that what allowed women to thrive in the Beit Midrash, in the university world, is the same thing that has made the Beit Midrash very resistant to the university world. And I think by that, in a sense, you mean both demographic and intellectual pluralism, if we put it broadly. I do want to flag that it was interesting for me that you said you did not encounter these texts in either the university or the Beit Midrash, and then the next sentence was, I encountered them in Hartman, because of course for many people, Hartman would still be considered the Beit Midrash. Right. I understand. Right. So it's probably sort of like Pardes, which is the closest thing to a Beit Midrash where I've spent a lot of time. So I also just have to say, you said, all in terms of our backgrounds, with wonderful respect and affection for my mother, who I appreciate is here. I certainly did not have a yeshiva education in Tallahassee, Florida, where I grew up. So I had the benefits of my parents' home and the well springs of tradition that they gave me, which took me other places later on. But I'll stop there.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and it did very, very helpful to get this feedback and thought-provoking. And I want to think about what does that provoke. And I'm looking this way, but I have my eyes here, here too. So I'll begin in the order, although I have to keep it short. So Duncan, thank you so very much. This is really exciting chapter. We actually were thinking about somebody outside of the immediacy of the rabbinic tradition versus academia to address these issues. One of the interesting disagreements that we had to do with, is this book for Jews only? And one of us, I wouldn't say who, was thinking that the book could potentially be of interest for much broader audiences interested in how Jews position themselves in the broader framework of humanities. And this is still my hope, and that's why definitely...
You won't say who it was.
No. Listen, it's my hope, but it doesn't mean that I said it. Okay, all right.
It's a dream.
All right, so that's okay. So yes, I do think that dreaming is important, and not only it is important, but it's absolutely essential. I will back it up by a quote from Kant, criticizing Herder. In an untrodden desert, a thinker, like a traveler, must remain free to choose his own path as he thinks best. One must wait to find out how successful he is and whether, after he has reached his goal, he will, in due time, find his way safely home again, i.e. to the seat of reason, and hence can count on having followers. So that's Kant criticizing Herder. I think that the three of us were trying to find a way back to the reason, even if Kantian reason is not exactly the reason in which I would like to have landed. Okay, so it's really welcome continuation and welcome direction, which I would like to see bring in real fruits in terms of publications and so on and so forth. My second remark concerns primarily collectively Deena's and Masua's comments in a very welcoming way. Namely, I want to ask a question as a result. Why is that so difficult? Why these terms, relativity and devotion, are so difficult? What is trying to express itself and fails to express itself behind this diagnostics. And I have two different thoughts, one related to immediately to Deena's tacit, polite, almost destruction of the book argument. And the other one with
Well put.
Masua's very nicely rereading of the book as a symptom rather than as a characterization. So I will begin with some dialectics in the very concepts which are being translated as relativity and devotion, but in tradition of the tradition, have their own terms and their own versions. And these terms, in many variations of them, I'm thinking about Miles Burnier's work and also about Paul Frank's application of that to analysis of German idealism. His terms, I think, skepticism and dogmatism, those are the terms. And the Miles Bernier provides a dialectics between the two. It works like this. Skeptic says, oh, everything is relative. Dogmatist says, no, there is absolute truth. And dogmatist says to the skeptic, well, listen, you said everything is relative, but this is an absolute statement. To which, so you are, in your relativism, you're an absolutist. To which smart skeptic would answer, according to Miles Bernier analysis, yeah, this is also relative. To say that these terms are really in flux between the others, these positions are not set in stone even structurally, meaning that there is an inner dialectics, or as Paul Franks put it, conundrum of skepticism and absolutism, or skepticism and dogmatism. It's a chiasm, they communicate with each other, conceptual, and that's already back to the Stoicism and back to the Roman period significantly. So what was then become a question is, one, how to express this nicely, because if you say dogmatism, that would be offensive, or I thought it would be offensive, so I was looking for some other terms, plus devotion in terms of beruf and in terms of calling was pretty much conducive of characterizing Wissenschaft des Judentums as a site of that very demonic dialectics. So, so it is not by chance that these terms are really dialectical to each other in whichever everyday language translations you lend them. So that's one comment. The other comment, well, I'll proceed with Deena's and with a huge thank you for making me think more and more about Zachor in one particular way, which has to do with the remarks which I have offered now, but which are not included in the book, that has to do with forgetting. Is Zachor, well, then it was, of course, I was very much fascinated by the book, and I was thinking, yes, memory is the main thing. But now I'm thinking about a Yiddish expression, which I can't really, I will just translate it into English. I don't even remember its Yiddish version. It goes like this. You can't remember it? Forget it. Right? So there is the gray area, the gray space between memory and forgetting, which you can't remember it, but you can't forget it either, which suggests on a psychological level something much deeper, and this is the primacy of forgetting. So I would have liked Yerushalmi have written a book, Al Tishkach. Talking about Purim and
For this Shabbat.
Right, Parashat Amalek. So for modern readers, it's extremely difficult to even understand. Well, remember erase the memory of Amalek. Don't forget. It's, for moderners, it's just what's going on here. But Shechacha and then Greek lethe are primary operations. They are forgetting, which underappreciated in our modern scope of personality, personhood, subjectivity, and so on and so forth, because we think memory of who you are is the foundational, forgetting is a danger. But I would have liked Chaim Yerushalmi have written the book about forget. And that's what's missing here. And I also hear the tension because, well, you know better how to interpret it, I agree. But my understanding that preliminary, that he really was insisting on divide, which he knew how to navigate, and maybe some others know how to navigate, but Jewish history and Jewish memory were not really compatible, only therefore they needed to be bridged, and maybe this bridge worked. Coming back to the analysis of the dialectics between dogmatism and relativism, it is dialectics, and therefore, that's what I'm putting on the table, the will rotates, it's never stable. To Masua, again, thank you. The analysis is fascinating, the diagnosis, reading the book as the diagnosis of the modern Judaism is wonderful. I am asking myself, I need to think more, how and whether the activism fit into the dialectics which I've described. Is it just another way to show the same dialectics in dynamic terms, or is it really the third way out? So I'll stop here. This is my way to say thank you, because when I really appreciate, I'm getting a little bit of critical, and because that also helps me to think more. So I'm really thankful.
So first of all, I think I really have to say thank you strongly in the beginning because I might be getting critical. So let's say thank you strongly. Really, thank you. No, you both, all three of you read the book so seriously. It's amazing. Okay, and we're not going to agree necessarily. So, okay. I know not everybody's read the book, but I'd like to start with two contributors in the book, Yonah Lavery Israeli and Aviva Richman. Both of them studied with me, fine. And Yonah Lavery Israeli just got Yadina and Smicha from me last summer. So I want to start from them, okay? Now that we read, so I'll explain, okay? Aviva Richman, for instance, Deena, you spoke about this. Aviva Richman turns to the fractures in the text. Let's go back, whatever. Halivni, and then Charles Sean Robert uses right to read against the grain, and so forth. And she turns to that to find the space for the ethical problem that she sees in the Talmud. And the Talmud itself has a kind of a fractured voice, and that allows her to find herself there. Yonah Lavery Israeli has this essay where she critiques studying or interpreting from pain. She's critiquing me. I'll just be honest, say it. She doesn't say that, but she's critiquing me. It's a valid critique, where she says, no, pain has to be transformed into something you don't carry as anger or pain anymore, in order to then be able to take that insight and wisdom you've learned from life, one has learned from life, to actually move forward, which is a great critique. I told her she's absolutely right. Those are two approaches. One approach is, the way I find myself is there's this big reified other out there. I need to fight against them. And the other one is, all there is another person out there saying advice. And this whole method of halacha, warm conversation, and Gemara, or this whole way of reading Gemara, which is not Halivni, there's an article coming out now in JTR on how to, beginning to show how I read the Stamma, as I finally discovered, I think, what the Stamma was in the original Babylonian classroom. Whatever, but forget the academic side, the critical, research side. I'm talking about the issues at play, right? Instead of looking for where I can find myself in, it's broadening who I'm hearing. So if somebody says something, and it's good advice, I just don't think it's the best advice for my present conditions, I'm like, okay, it's still good advice. It's a cold day, wear a coat. It's a warm day, drink a cold drink. Great, good advice. Not perfect advice, but good advice. And then I broaden the circle of who I'm hearing, and that takes us to the classics, and broadening the classics. And then I'm not in a fight with anybody because they're all giving good advice. I'm just trying to figure out how to balance it well for the conditions in which I live, or if you will, my subculture, right? Because we're all living in subcultures. maybe of individuals. I'm not getting into that. You're all great theoreticians, so whatever we are. Okay? But it's a different picture. And I think between that, the question of like the possibilities of classical texts, as you said, I'm less interested in the possibilities of classical texts as much as just the wisdom. Okay, so I taught in China 3 times in university, and I had the students use the method I teach with Chinese texts. And I said, do it with your sources, and then their test was, how well are they doing it with their sources, right? Sorry, I wrote this down. I apologize. Let me take a look at. Sorry, Deena. Yes, sorry. Zachor. We come back to Zachor all the time. Okay, right? Okay, Yerushalmi.
It's in our text.
That's what a classic is.
Okay, he's like, I want to be connected to tradition in ways that allow me to keep creating. Okay, in a sense. I'm sorry, can we rephrase you back, I think. And I'm like, no, I just want to be connected to tradition because I want to learn how to be human. Oh, I think I skipped a critical step. I don't teach anybody how to be Jewish. I couldn't care less. I teach people how to be human within all these sources. Classically Jewish, because that's what I love. Chinese, that's what they're doing, and so forth. I'm just teaching people how to be human, in which case, if it's worthwhile, they'll continue. If it's not, they won't. I don't have this reified ideology, cultural concerns, just trying to navigate the world. So it's a different picture. Am I making any sense? At least?
It's very beautiful. I would go back to how you paraphrased what I was saying about Yerushalmi, and it didn't totally resonate for me, but I actually think regardless, it's very nice to think about your engagement as a teacher with others as a means by which you can understand others and ideally provide the possibility of, how to be human in the best ways possible. So.
And then it turns out, fine. What you said about Yerushalmi, the attempt of, we have history in order to put the possibilities of history. It's not your word. Do you want me to check? So,
I don't know.
Fine. That's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
I'll move on. And okay. And therefore, Masua, like I'm going back to, I guess now we're getting to a little bit Jewish politics, and we're online. We're not recorded, right?
We are recorded. We're not online.
Oh, well.
We're not online, but we are recorded. This is immortalized. Go on.
So what doesn't place me, let's say, in Hartman, okay, is the attempt to move a text to where I want it to be is an attempt to basically impose myself and my echo chamber. And in a sense, that's why we read poetry, because often good poetry doesn't have a specific message. That's what it's meant to be, right? For us to kind of reflect off of it and build. But if I'm looking for advice and guidance, because life's complicated and there's lots of advice out there, then it's a different model. Yes, which I'm going to respond to Sergey in a moment, sorry. And therefore, I'm not in favor of forgetfulness. I'm in favor of remembering everything that humans have ever said. I don't have to like it because it's probably the reason, if I don't like it, it's probably true-ish. And I'm not liking it because it's bothering me, because it's true. Ish. Meaning it's true, but it's not a capital T true. It's not reified, because nothing's reified. But it's true advice. I'm like, I don't want to hear that thing. Sorry, I'll just close with a simple example. Last night, we didn't, whatever. By the time the fast ended, whatever, food near campus, I don't know. We didn't find really solid kosher food. And my wife said to me this morning, she said, what? You didn't really eat? I'm like, well, there wasn't many options. There weren't many options. But she's right. It doesn't matter whether I agree with what I should have done and she thinks I should have done. She's right. Her advice is correct, and I may be correct in the other way. Okay, so I think that's what I was hoping that in some way this book, I know there are articles here that go against the grain of the book. You said that, Masua, right? Okay, I know that, but I'm still hoping that this book gets us to just let go of all our standard reifications, because they're just reifications.
Can I just say one sentence? A lot of the times, how will I say it so it won't be insulting? I just ruined it. It'll be insulting anyway now. I'm sorry. No. there is no need to move the text anywhere if the text is on your side originally.
Right. Or if there's no text. I don't live in a world of text. Really, that's why I'm not in academia. That's why in yeshivas they barely tolerate me. I don't live in a world of text. I live in a world of people. That's what I'm learning from. I don't care about text. There are no authoritative. That's not true, because I choose to live a certain cultural way. My wife's more religiously conservative than me. Fine, that keeps me in check. Fine, but that not like that's no. I'm not interested in finding myself. Blanked out. Blood, woman, feminist, writer, Harvard professor, woman, feminist, Harvard professor. Blanking out.
Oh,
Classic.
Who? I don't know.
No, not Jewish.
A classicist at Harvard?
No, not classicist, classic feminist, 1970s, 80s.
Carolyn Bynum.
I'm blanking. I can't believe I'm blanking out.
Well, tell us the
But okay.
tell us the text if
point
you can't
is-
remember the person.
Nice.
Well
Nice.
played.
I can't believe I'm blanking out. Anyway, I remember
I have no jet lag right now, okay?
Okay, anyway, the first time I read her, really not just feminist, anti-man, like men, right? First time I read her, I remember saying, wow, I don't know what's going on, I just know she hates men. Great. Second time I read her, I said, something's going on. Like, I already read Betty Friedan, that's easy. Yeah, Betty Friedan's calm and, 70s, fine. And then, third time I read her, I said, oh, okay, these are good insights. Now, of course, the question is, will we agree on the balance, the application, right? That's what I'm talking about. There's no such thing as everything's true. There is no authoritative text. And I know many people live with this Judaism thing, right? Like, I get it, but like there's
Orthodox rabbi. I just want to put that out there.
no, but
But
no.
an Israeli Orthodox rabbi, which is different.
But yes, I don't have that
You don't have
pulpit.
to. You don't
I
need to.
Right, I don't need to. And correct, right. And when I'm, say in China, I'm not interested in making people Jewish. I'm interested in, yeah. So I'll just try to close with that. That I just lost the frame of thought. Yes, if nobody has power over me, because basically I'm going to die and suffer anyway, then there is no text that has power over me. If there's no text that has power over me, then I could just learn from people and their advice. Because I'm going to lose in the end anyway. Therefore, we can win along the way, minor battles. Okay, that was a lot of philosophy in one. Okay, fine. I'm done. Sorry.
We should applaud the editor. Okay. Yeah, there are several minutes. Fortunately, so David, yes, you were quick. Yeah.
Duncan's lucid remarks about the classics discipline and the critique of traditional classics discipline for its enduring provincialism, and wanted to point out that there is in the study of Jewish history a comparable discourse that actually hasn't been alluded to yet today among historians of considerable concern that Jewish history has been a parochial enterprise in the same way that Duncan has characterized classics. And although there have been a number of responses to this, one that I don't think has been mentioned, although perhaps it's implied by the last speaker, a distinction commonly made now is the distinction between communal and dispersionist approaches to Jewish history. And communalist approaches focus on communal Jewry and its history and on Judaism. Dispersionist spokesmore is dealing with what is a vast, vast domain, post-Judaic Jews and what they do. I mean, the tradition of Isaac Deutscher's non-Jewish Jew, which I was surprised didn't come up here at all. Now, this tradition of studying the dispersionist history of Jews is so widespread. I guess I'm a little surprised not to hear it invoked here, and I'm curious as to whether the authors, the editors of this book, considered that and decided on principle not to include it. I mean, I think, I got the other here a few weeks ago. I was chairing a session at a convention of American historians. There was a session on Jewish history that I chaired, and all 5 of the papers were in dispersionist rather than communalist tradition of studying Jewish history. And here on this campus, I mean, my colleague Yuri Slezkin and I have been writing dispersionist stuff for 25 or 30 years. So it's not inconspicuous. And we have many studies now of second wave feminism, which is basically a secular Jewish conspiracy. I mean, it's all secular Jewish women. These are not Judaic. These are Jews. Now, are we going to say that second wave feminism doesn't have something Jewish about it? Are we going to say that the Soviet secret police, which Slezkin established was the most overwhelmingly Jewish institution in the Soviet Union, we're going to say that the Soviet secret police, there's nothing Jewish about it? So there's a vast domain of the study of Jews in history under this dispersionist canopy. Now, if there's a book of the orientation and the potential audience that you've described, would seem to me to be one that would reach an audience that's interested in that. So I'm wondering if you guys decided that, well, I can remember, I remember one time, this has actually only happened to me once in all the Jewish history conferences that I've gone to. David, the stuff you and Yuri write, the stuff you and Yuri Slezkin write, it's not Jewish history. So I respond, who tells me what's Jewish history?
I think almost difficult to respond to. I think Ethan is the most likely. I want to mention something, but it ties between, which is actually this category of wisdom, right, which is quite resonant and relates to, in some ways, with provinciality. So I was reading the Chabad website for reasons that I won't explain now. But the writer of this particular article was trying to explain what had gone wrong with American universities to explain the rise of anti-Semitism that is perceptible. And the answer was, well, Chochma Yavanit, Greek wisdom, means that people are rolling around in the muck. There's a kind of pun joke with the name for Greek and dirt, and there's a total possibility, of course, that the provinciality of the university can be reinscribed from the Beit Midrash side as a kind of provinciality that is dangerous. So this provinciality can be identified in multiple ways, not just from my sort of critical, the critical race theoretical influence, but the provinciality looks different from different. I'm sure you would agree that not all provincialities are equally provincial. But I should pass to a much more expert.
I mean, I'll just respond with thank you, David. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in this book. A lot of things we didn't get to. So I guess I would say, it's interesting you talk about dispersionist versus communalist. It's actually not a debate that I have heard a lot, really, in my career in those terms. Yeah. So there's definitely a debate, right, about like, is the history of feminism where there are a lot of Jews, is that Jewish history, right? There's that debate. But so I think, in part, where I came to this project, now that you put it in these terms, which are very useful, is, I think we moved away from communalist writing in Jewish studies in the academy, and I think it's been moved away from for a pretty long time in a pretty dramatic fashion, aside from certain fields that are, often closer to the texts that are traditional texts, but even in those fields in significant ways. And so I think in that process, right, part of what led me into this, part of our purpose together was oftentimes the people who have come to write some very important work in what you refer to as dispersionist Jewish studies have done so without much knowledge of the traditional canon. And what I would submit, right, is there's no question there are Jewish things about modern feminism, second wave feminism. There's no question there are Jewish things about the way the secret police operated in the Soviet Union. We would be hard pressed to give a really good answer to what's Jewish about those things only from demographics or only from what we know about Jewish culture in the 20th century in an entirely or mostly secular realm removed from the canon. And that we would probably have better and much more interesting answers to those questions if we could do a deeper dive, which comes from the kinds of approaches we're advocating here.
Is there room for a short?
Can we take one more question from the audience rather than...
Sure.
Yeah.
And then people, we can respond to whatever. You want to take two? Why don't we take 2 or 3 and
Two-
then
two or
we'll
three.
respond to whatever we want?
Yeah, so Sarah, I see. Sorry, I went forward to back, but yes.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe introduce yourself.
Oh,
Because I know you all, but these
okay.
guys don't.
I'm Sarah Levin, a lecturer in Jewish studies. And actually, I had 3 comments sort of on my 3 stages of life at this university. So I'll start with the most recent, though. I mean, this was just fascinating, and I really can't wait to read the book. And it brings me back to my graduate studies here with these kind of dynamic conversations. So I realize how nostalgic I am for that. But also, I also never heard this dispersional versus communal, but I definitely teach dispersionally. You know, we look at Lilith, like in my folktales class, in the religious texts, and then take it into modern feminist views of it. You know, and that is how I teach. But yeah, I'm interested that I haven't actually heard the terms either, but I like knowing them. But so I'm going to go backwards chronologically, starting with yesterday here. So in my life as a lecturer in Jewish studies, Professor David Myers was here from UCLA and talking about dialogue across the divide that's happening now on campuses, especially among students and given what's going on. So both the challenges and opportunities. And he said a lot of wonderful things, but I just wanted to point to what Elisha said, sort of the essence of what he was saying was, when I'm trying to understand someone, I don't judge. And I just thought that was beautiful, and it just reminded me right here in this room yesterday, that kind of thrust of talking across divides. And then second, so my time as a graduate student, starting in Near Eastern Studies, because I thought Jewish studies was too parochial, but and I had no background in it, but I got moved over to it. And actually, it was absolutely wonderful because it was totally dialogue. You know, my closest peers were, I mean, as I told Eric Gruen, I actually always felt like a misfit because it was either the Israelis studying Hebrew and Yiddish literature or the yeshiva bookers. But they were my pals, too, as well as my Arabic studies and Islamic studies pals. Unfortunately, I didn't get to know Ruth, even though we overlapped. Yeah, but we were in the same classes. But it totally, I mean, sadly, and may his memory be blessed, I came to study folklore with Alan Dundes, who died my first year, and I hadn't taken his graduate seminar because Tova Rosen was here teaching Andalusian Jewish history, which I had to take. I mean, Andalusian Jewish poetry. Hebrew poetry, sorry. Anyway, but so Hannah Kronfeld, when I was brokenhearted, said, you have to go to GTU and study with Deena Stein. You'll love her and she'll love you. And that's what I did. And I had no idea the difference in Midrash, Mishnah, Talmud. I didn't know what any of those texts were, and that started my discovery. Started as a beginner. She let me in with the Talmud Buchers, Yeshiva Buchers, my second semester with her. And then on to Galit Hazan Rokem came a few times while I was studying, and Daniel Boyarin. And it was so rich and enriching. And what they call the Caesarian or Caesarea, apparently with Jonathan Levinson, that they all used to meet in Caesarea in Israel, and that was their method of reading Talmud. And it was exactly what Alan Dundy's, said. You have text, context, and texture, for how you work. And that's how Deena taught me to read these texts. And that's what I used when I did my ethnography work in Morocco and Israel, taking the text, contextualizing it, looking at the texture. And so it was really that beautiful, I just want to say, and Ruth and I were the last students in the PhD program, but to me it did, I don't know, you can agree or disagree, but it felt like that beautiful dialoguing constantly. And then finally, just a brief note on my undergrad career, which was 25 years before my graduate one here, and I was doing comparative literature. And I think I was one of the first classes in the 70s where you didn't have to have a classics language for your BA, but you had to take 2 classics courses, but they could be in translation. You still, for the graduate work, had to do Greek or Latin. And I fantasized doing my PhD in comparative literature, and I had already decided I'm going to fight for Hebrew and Arabic as my classical languages. So just a note on that. So thank you.
And maybe we'll have the one last question, and then we'll.
Hanan.
Yeah, Hanan, yeah.
Does someone else have a hand up? Hanan Alexander.
Mine is more by way of a question. I wanted to pick up on Duncan's wonderful comment about Bildung, which sort of led me to think. I mean, I'm a philosopher of education, so everybody sees the world through the lens that they think about things. I saw this as a wonderful discourse on the nature of education. Ari Kelman has a wonderful book coming out called Jewish Education, in which he argues that Jewish studies is really just a form of Jewish education, in the sense of not necessarily the transmission of the Jewish tradition across the generations, but introducing students to the literatures of Jewish studies. Of what Jews have written in one of these senses, and that here's my question. So that was all, by the way, to sort of get to the conversation about education. So you've talked. I mean, there's been a bunch of discussion about relativism, pluralism, all of which around this notion of skepticism or being critical. And I want to comment and sort of ask you about. Actually, there are 2. Sometimes diametrically opposed ways to using the term critical in the academy today. One is grounded in sort of Kantian rationality that Sergey, I think, alluded to, and a number of others, which is has a tendency toward absolutist way of thinking about skepticism, that there is a reason and that our consciousness can somehow understand it. And the other is to think about being critical as being appropriately attuned to the deleterious or problematic nature of power and the way in which power corrupts. And sometimes in the philosophy of education literature, we distinguish between critical thinking, which is of the first variety, and critical consciousness, following the likes of Paulo Freire, which is of the second variety. And in both cases, we, at least in the circles that I travel in, try and figure out how one comes about acquiring an appreciation for the one or the other when one goes from the childhood that Deena mentioned into what some of us call the age of reason or maturity or adulthood, or something that happens after 12 or 13 or 14 years old, in which a person begins to ask questions about things. And when you think about that, this dichotomy between the devotional on the one hand, which has a tendency toward being dogmatic, and what you've called relativistic on the other hand, sort of disintegrates, which I think is what you're after. That's it's a kind of question, it's a kind of comment, but it's also a way of suggesting there's a whole huge literature that talks about how this disintegration takes place. That might be of interest.
Rebecca also had a question, but actually we're gonna forget a part of this. I'm gonna let the camera person stop recording because I realize it's past our time. But the conversation is still going, so thank you so much. But we can continue our conversation, but it won't be recorded.